We ended up stumbling across this house and we saw that it had a little cottage in the backyard, and we came up with the idea that maybe I could set that up as a bed and breakfast.
At home in Sydney's picturesque northern beaches, Felicity Stevens is preparing to host guests in the Airbnb out the back of her house.
I love welcoming people to the cottage. We get to meet people from all over the world.
Over the past decade, Airbnb and Stayz have become two of the biggest players offering travellers more options for accommodation than ever before. But they've also increasingly faced backlash over concerns they're contributing to Australia's housing affordability crisis.
We are in a housing crisis. More than 4,100 homes in the city of Melbourne that are being used for short stay accommodation. We'd like to see them flipped into longer term homes.
More and more state and local governments have now begun cracking down on the sector with new restrictions and regulations.
We don't think that we should be the whipping boy for those things, because we don't agree with the premise that we are either the cause or the solution to the housing affordability and availability problem.
When we look at the number of dwellings that are being used for short-term rentals, we typically expect to see that they're a very small percentage of the overall housing market. And so it's important to remember that regulating short-term rental accommodation in isolation will not solve the housing crisis.
Someone who knows just what the impact of short-term holiday rentals has been is Nicole Gurran, a professor of urban and regional planning who's been crunching the numbers.
There's robust research evidence now internationally that the more short-term rentals in an area, the tighter a rental market, and you see that tight rental market flow on in terms of higher rents and higher house prices.
Professor Gurran says while they haven't caused Australia's housing crisis, they have exacerbated it in some regions.
The research evidence shows too that when you take short-term rentals out of the market and return them back to the long-term rental supply, that rents also fall in an area.
The idea with any tax or cap is to incentivise landlords to lease their homes on the long-term rental market instead of Airbnb. Around the world, short-stay accommodation regulations are vastly different from city to city. In London and San Francisco, hosts can only rent out their property for 90 days at most per year, while Florence and Singapore have effectively banned Airbnb altogether. In Australia, dozens of local councils have set measures like rent caps and annual fees. The City of Melbourne is the latest, voting last week to put a 180-day cap on the number of days hosts can list short-term rental properties and a yearly $350 fee. The Victorian Government is also working on a proposal to regulate short-term accommodation as part of its housing package to be announced this month.
Some of our townships are, in short, inundated with short-term accommodation. Estimates for the whole peninsula go up to as high as 10,000 properties.
I'm on Victoria's Mornington Peninsula, and it's tourist hotspots like this that are often among the first to regulate Airbnbs, as the rise in short-term holiday rentals leads to a rise in complaints to local councils.
It's everything from parking problems to rubbish to noise complaints.
It's become an administrative headache for Mornington Mayor Steve Holland.
We get complaints, particularly over summer, on a daily basis from residents. You know, these areas are zoned residential, people buy there, they want to live there full time, they want to raise their family, they've got a right to the peaceful enjoyment of their property, and they've effectively got a commercial business set up next door to them.
5 years ago, the council brought in laws requiring hosts of short-term rentals like Airbnb to register their property, abide by a code of conduct and pay a $335 annual fee. So far, around 3,000 properties have registered, but the Mayor believes the real number is likely to be double or triple that.
How successful have those regulations been?
They haven't been as successful as we'd like, and this is a problem right across Victoria for all councils. We actually lack the legal ability to regulate in this space.
Along with the noise concerns, the peninsula has also suffered from growing homelessness and a housing shortage.
Do you think the regulations have had sort of any effect on that issue of the tight rental or housing market?
Look, anecdotally, we think that some of those properties may have returned to the long-term rental market. However, that's only anecdotal.
Steve Holland wants councils to be granted greater powers to enforce regulations on short-term rentals, but he doesn't want to get rid of them altogether.
The Mornington Peninsula is a high tourist destination. We rely on short-term rentals. It's actually really important for our economy and really important for the 8 million visitors that come to the Mornington Peninsula every year. And so our appetite is not to get rid of short-term rentals. What we'd like to see is a fairer balance between the permanent residents and the commercial operators on the Mornington Peninsula.
Stop overthinking it. Your perfect summer holiday is closer than you think.
Airbnb and Stayz both want the sector to be regulated by state governments, not by local councils.
We want to see statewide registration schemes and statewide systems to make sure that we don't have multiple different councils taking multiple different approaches on the same policy issues.
The New South Wales government has been one of the first in the country to regulate the growing short-term rental market. Almost 2 years ago, it brought in regulations for Sydney and some regional towns, requiring registration, a code of conduct, an annual fee and a cap on nights.
For example, in New South Wales, if a property or a person or a platform gets recorded with 2 strikes over the course of a 2-year period, they are actually banned from letting that property for 5 years. We support those things because they bring integrity to the sector.
But the short-term companies are divided over one measure. A nightly levy of a few dollars paid by tourists, sometimes referred to as a bed tax, is one of the measures the Victorian government is considering. While Airbnb supports the measure, competitor Stayz isn't so keen.
Arbitrary things like a bed tax that have been proposed by some people, I don't think are the right way. Decisions which are designed to actually target us for the purposes of dealing with an economic problem are not the right way to go.
Professor Nicole Garin believes nightly caps are one of the more effective regulations to address housing shortages, as they provide the greatest incentive to return properties to the rental market.
That nightly cap then prevents a permanent landlord who owns a permanent rental property from them flipping that from the permanent rental sector into the short-term rental market.
There's a whole host of reasons that people will put their place on Airbnb. Some people hosting like me, it is their job and it helps them be there for their families.
Airbnb host Felicity Stevens says the costs and benefits of short-term rentals need to be carefully considered.
When you have hosts in remote and regional areas, it brings in a tourism dollar, and that can be really powerful to the local economy. So we need a balance.